Before we start today, I wanted to say this episode covers some genuinely heavy historical material, the Holocaust, and specifically life inside Nazi concentration camps, because the book we are discussing was written by someone who survived them. If that's a difficult subject for you right now, that's completely understandable, and it's okay to skip this one and come back another time. For everyone, continuing on, in 1942, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was deported along with his wife and parents to a concentration camp. Over the next 3 years, he was moved through 4 difficult camps. He lost his wife, his parents, and his brother. He survived with essentially nothing, no positions, no status, no certainty he would live another day. And in the middle of that, as both a survivor and trained psychiatrist, observing everyone around him, he started noticing something specific: the people who survived, psychologically as much as physically, were not necessarily the strongest or the healthiest. They tended to be the ones who had found some reasons to keep going, a person to return to, unfinished work, or some sense of meaning that outlasted the immediate horror of the day they were living through. That observation became the foundation for man's searching for meaning, a book that's part of survivors' account and part psychological theory, and one of its central claims is almost unparallelably direct, that meaning, not pleasure, and not even survival itself, its primary force that allows a human being to endure suffering that would otherwise be unbearable. By the end of this episode, you will understand Frankl's account of psychological survival under extreme conditions, the theory of meaning he built from it afterward, called logotherapy, and how these ideas apply carefully and without minimizing the extremity of his original experience to ordinary suffering in ordinary life. Let's go into it. Some context on the author: because of his professional background before the war directly shaped how he processed what happened to him. Before his deportation, Frankl was already a participating psychiatrist and neurologist in Vienna, and he had already begun developing early versions of the theories that would become logotherapy. His approach to psychotherapy centered on the idea that he primarily human drive in a search for meaning, distinguishing it from earlier psychological frameworks that centered drives like pleasure or power instead. What makes this book unusual, and part of why it has remained so widely read for over 70 years, is that Frankl wasn't simply theorizing from the comfortable academic distance. He was tested against his own theory in most extreme circumstances imaginable, and the book that resulted is split into 2 distinct parts: a first-hand account of his time in the camps, and then more structured explanation of logotherapy itself, built partly from what he observed in himself and others during the period. He wrote the first part of the book, the memoir section, in a remarkably short period of time after his liberation, reportedly dictating much of it in just a few days, driven by an urgency to record what he would witness it while it remained vivid. That urgency comes through in the prose. It is direct, unsentimental, and notably free of self-pity, which is part of what makes its observations feel more credible rather than less. Let us start with the observational core of the book, what Frankl actually noticed as both prisoner and a trained clinician, about how people responded psychologically to conditions of extreme, sustained suffering. He describes a process many prisoners went through, roughly moving from initial shock upon arrival through a period of relative emotional apathy that developed as a kind of protective numbing against constant horror and loss. They eventually, for those who survived to liberation, into a difficult process of psychological adjustment to ordinary life and freedom, which he noticed was its own distinct kind of struggle, not an automatic relief. Within that broader arc, he made a specific observation that became central to his later theory: prisoners who maintained some connection to a source of meaning, thinking of a loved one waiting for them, a piece of work left unfinished, or a spiritual or philosophical conviction that gave their suffering some kind of context, appeared to have a better chance of enduring the psychological weight of the camps than those who lost any sense of purpose. He was careful not to claim this guaranteed physical survival, which depended heavily on factors entirely outside anyone's control, like which work detail you were assigned to or pure chance. But he observed a clear difference in how people carried their suffering internally, and in many cases, how long they seemed able to keep going at all. One of the most quoted lines from the book captures this directly: the idea that everything can be taken from a person except one final freedom, the ability to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, even circumstances offering no other choice at all. Frankl is not claiming attitude could undo the physical reality of the camps, or that suffering under those conditions was somehow acceptable because of unavailable attitude adjustment. He's making a narrower, more specific claim that even in conditions of total external powerlessness, there remained one internal domain that could not be fully controlled by an outside force, and that domain mattered enormously to psychological endurance. Here is a claim from the book that I think is genuinely one of the more difficult and important ideas in it, so let's take it slowly. Frankl argues that suffering, when it can't be avoided, becomes appearable specifically when it can be given some kind of meaning. Not that suffering itself is good, or that people should seek it out, but that unavoidable suffering does not have to be purely destructive, if a person can locate some sense of purpose within it or in spite of it. This is different from simply telling someone to look on the bright side. Frankl is making a more specific, almost structural claim about what allows a person to endure difficulty without being psychologically broken by it. He illustrates this with an account from his clinical practice after the war, describing an older man grieving his wife's death, devastated that he was left to endure the pain of losing her rather than her having to endure the pain of losing him. Frankl asked him to consider it from the other direction, that his own suffering, difficult as it was, had actually spared his wife from experiencing that same grief, which meant his pain had become, in a specific sense, an act of love on her behalf. The man's grief didn't disappear, but Frankl observed it became more bearable once it had been reframed with a specific meaning attached to it, rather than experience it as pure, purposeless loss. This connects to a broader argument in the book. Frankl believed that a great deal of psychological distress, particularly in the modern life outside of extreme circumstances like the camps, come not from suffering itself but from a sense that one's life or one's suffering lacks any meaning at all, a condition he called the existential vacuum. He observed this specifically in people who had, materially, very little to complain about, suggesting that meaning, or its absence, operates somewhat independently of external circumstances or material comfort. Let's get into the more structured psychological theory Frankl built from these observations, which he called logotherapy, a name drawn from Greek's word logos, roughly meaning a reason. Frankl positioned logotherapy in contrast to two earlier, highly influential psychological frameworks, where one major tradition centered the pleasure principle, the idea that humans are primarily driven to seek pleasure and avoid pain, and other centered the will to power and status. Frankl proposed a third primary drive, the will to meaning, the idea that human beings are fundamentally oriented toward finding purpose and significance in their lives, and that this drive, when frustrated, produces its own distinct from a physiologically suffering, separate from simple unmet pleasure or unmet ambition. A key feature of his theory is that meaning, in his framework, is not something invented or manufactured purely internally. It is something discovered, specific to each individual's unique circumstances, relationships, and choices, rather than a single universal answer that applies identically to everyone. He was skeptical of the idea that there is one correct meaning of life in the abstract, arguing instead that the question should be inverted. Rather than asking what the meaning of life is in general, each person is being asked, by specific circumstances of their own life, to respond with how they will live and what they will do. Meaning is found in response, not handed down as abstract answering in advance. He identified 3 primary paths through which he believed people typically discover meaning: through meaningful work or creative undertaking of some kind, through genuine relationships and love, and significantly given his own experience through the attitude one takes toward unavoidable suffering when suffering can be changed or escaped. This third path is what makes his theory distinct from frameworks that locate meaning only in achievement or connections, since it explicitly accounts from situations like the ones he lived through, where neither productive work or undistributed relationships remain available options. Here is a concept from later in the book that I think is one of the most sophisticated ideas Franklin developed, precisely because it avoids the trap of naive positivity while still refusing pure despair. He calls it tragic optimism, a stance that acknowledges what he refers to as the tragic trait of human existence: pain, guilt, and death, all of which are, to some degree, unavoidable parts of many human life. Rather than denying these realities or being crushed by them, tragic optimism involves finding a way to say yes to life in spite of these unavoidable difficulties, transforming suffering into some form of human achievement, drawing responsible guidance from guilt toward growth, and treating the transience of life as motivation to act meaningfully within the time available, rather than as a reason for despair. This is distinct from the kind of first surface level positivity that simply denies difficulty exists. Frankl is explicit that pretending pain, guilt, or mortality are not real is not optimism at all. It's avoidance, and it tends to leave people more fragile, not less, when the reality eventually asserts itself. Tragic optimism holds both realities simultaneously. The difficulty is real and often severe, and meaning remains available in spite of it, not because the difficulty has been minimized or explained away. He connects this directly to his earlier clinical observation of what he called the existential vacuum, a specific modern form of suffering he saw increasingly in his post-war practice, characterized by the persistent feeling of the emptiness or boredom that is not reducible to any specific external problem. His argument is that as external structures that used to supply meaning by default, tradition, religious frameworks, and rigid social rules weakened in modern life, more individuals were left having to actively locate meaning from themselves rather than inheriting it automatically. And many people, lacking practice or guidance in doing this, experience the resulting gap as a diffuse, hard-to-name emptiness rather than a specific, solvable problem. Toward the end of the book, Frankl makes an argument connecting freedom and responsibility that I think is genuinely underappreciated compared to some of his more widely quoted ideas. He argues that the freedom, properly understood, is incomplete without responsibility, and he goes as far as suggesting that the statue of liberty on the American East Coast should, in some symbolic sense, be balanced by a statue of responsibility on the West Coast, because freedom without an accompanying sense of responsibility for how what that freedom is used tends to degrade it into arbitrariness rather than genuine meaning. In his framework, the specific freedom he emphasizes throughout the book, the freedom to choose one's attitude and response even under trained circumstances, is not meant as an excuse for passivity or self-indulgence. It means as an active obligation to respond meaningfully to whatever life is specifically asking of you, given your particular circumstances, relationships, and choices available at that moment. This connects back to his broader inversion of the question of meaning, rather than life owning you an answer about what it all means. In his framework, you owe life a responsible answer given through your actions to what your specific circumstances are asking of you. The reframing shifts meaning from something passively received to something actively enhanced, enacted. The moment-to-moment choice to choice, which is part of why his theory remains applicable even to people whose lives look nothing like his own extreme historical circumstances. I want to be careful here because there is a real risk in taking ideas forgot, in taking ideas forged in the extremity of concentration camps and applying them casually or ordinarily daily frustrations in a way that trivializes what Frankl actually lived through. So let's be precise about the right way to translate this. Frankl, he himself in later writing and interviews, was clear that he was not arguing all suffering is equivalent or that ordinary difficulty should be met with the same framework as literal survival under genocide. What he did argue is that the underlying psychological mechanism, meaning making difficulty more bearable, and its absence making even comparatively minor difficulty feel unbearable, operates on a continuum that applies at much smaller scales too, even though the stakes and severity are obviously not comparable. A frustrating job, a difficult health diagnosis, a period of grief, or a stretch of ordinary boredom and impotence can all, at much smaller scale, benefit from the same underlying questions his theory asks. Given specific and chosen circumstances, what meaningful response is available to me right now? The honest, respectful way to apply this book to ordinary life is not to say, my problems are basically like a concentration camp. That would badly misrepresent both the book and the reality of what Frankl and millions of others endured. It is to take the narrower, transferable insight seriously that actively searching for meaning with difficulty rather than only trying to escape or numb the difficult tends to change how bearable that difficult feels, regardless of its scale, and that insight was in through the most extreme test imaginable, which is exactly what gives it its unusual weight. Before we get to the practical work through, it's worth spending a moment on why this particular book has had a such wide, lasting influence well beyond psychology, because that really tells you something about the durability of the underlying idea. Logotherapy went on to directly influence later developments in psychotherapy, particularly approaches that emphasizes helping people locate a sense of purpose or coherent narrative around difficult life events, rather than only focusing on symptoms reduction. But the book's influence extends well past clinical psychology. It's commonly cited in fields like organizational leadership, medicine, and grief counseling, in each case for a version of the same core insight. People facing difficulty, whatever its scale, tend to fare better when they can locate some sense of purpose or meaning connected to what they are going through, compared to facing the same difficulty with no such connection available. Frankl's specific historical circumstances also give the book a kind of credibility that's hard to replicate. Plenty of writers have argued that the meaning matters more than comfort or pleasure. Very few of them developed that argument while surviving the camp, watching that theory tested against the most extreme conditions history has produced. That's part of why the book continues to be assigned in fields as varied as medical training, military resilience programs, and grief counseling. The claim is not coming from comfortable theorizing, it's coming from direct, extreme, and clinically observed experience. It's also worth noting that Frankl continued developing and refining logotherapy for decades after the war, working with patients facing a wide range of difficulties that had nothing to do with historical atrocity, job loss, terminal illness, depression, grief, the ordinary texture of human suffering. That later clinical work is part of what allows the book's central insight to generalize responsibly beyond his own original extreme circumstances, since he spent much of the rest of his career testing and applying the same framework across far more ordinary forms of human difficulty. Let's make this concrete carefully and proportionately. Say you are going through a genuinely difficult period, a health diagnosis, a job loss, or prolonged stretch of grieving for a family member, the kind of ordinary but real hardship most people face at some point. Start by asking Frankl inverted questions directly, rather than asking, why this is happening to me, or what does this mean? In the abstract, ask, give this specific situation what's being asked of me right now, and how do I want to respond? Look for the meaning through the three paths he identified. Is there meaningful work or creative task still available to you within these circumstances, even a small one? Is there a relationship you can deepen or show up for during this period? And if neither of these is currently available, what attitude are you choosing to take to work? A difficulty you can't currently change. Watch for the existential vacuum specifically. If the distress you are feeling seems less connected to those concrete difficulty itself and more like a diffuse emptiness or sense that nothing matters, that's worth naming directly, because Frankl's framework suggests its often response is better to actively locating a source of meaning than to simply trying to feel better in general sense. Practice tragic optimism rather than forced positivity. Acknowledge the real difficulty of the situation honestly without minimizing it, while also staying open to the possibility that some form of growth, connection, or meaning remains available in spite of it, not because the difficulty has been erased. Hold the freedom responsibility bearing. Remember that the specific freedom available to you, your attitude, your response, your choice within the constraint, comes with an active obligation to use it deliberately, rather than treating the difficulty purely as something happening to you with no room for your own agency inside it. That's the framework, translated carefully and without overstating the comparison into ordinary relationship herd. Let's bring it home. Frankl observed that psychological endurance under extreme suffering was strongly connected to whether a person maintained some sense of meaning or purpose, even when nothing else about their circumstances could be controlled. The one freedom that can't be fully removed by external circumstances in his framework is the freedom to choose one's own attitude and response. Logotherapy proposes a will to meaning as primary human drive, distinct from a drive toward pleasure or a drive toward power or status. Meaning is discovered through three primary paths: meaningful work, genuine relationships, and the attitude taken toward unavoidable suffering. Tragic optimism means honestly acknowledging pain, guilt, and mortality while still finding meaning in spite of them, distinct from denial or faced positivity. Freedom, in Frankl's view, is incomplete without responsibility. The specific freedom to choose your response carries an obligation to use it deliberately. If this episode moved you, I would encourage reading the book directly rather than relying on this summary. Frankl's own words, particularly in the memoir section, carry a weight that's genuinely worth experiencing firsthand. Subscribe for more of these deep dives. We will be back soon with another book breakdown. Until then, see you next time.